So I am once again going to put together some escalation style lists, but this time for the backstabbing Skaven. Skaven probably have the hardest time of building a list in the old world just because so many of their good units are locked behind various taxes that take them. And when doing an escalation style list, it is hard to balance that with getting the units you want into a competent list. But I took my best stab at it. I got some interesting interactions on the tabletop, and hopefully at very minimum, this will give you some good ideas for your own lists. Before I dive into it, I'm going to go over the basics of what an escalation style league is. So in an escalation league, you usually start at a low point value, usually 500, sometimes 1,000, and then after say a month or every 3 weeks or whatever you guys decide on, you add more points to the army, sometimes stepping up 250 points, sometimes 500 points. A common restriction in escalation style leagues is that once a unit is added, it can no longer be removed. So, for example, if we build a block of giant rats at 500 points, we must have at least one block of giant rats for all future lists in this league. That block may grow bigger or smaller, but we must have the block. This is also true for hero units, but you can mount them, dismount them, upgrade them, downgrade them at will as well. So, you can start with a Skaven chieftain, upgrade him to a warlord, and then downgrade him later, and it all counts as the same unit. Detachments, like the Skaven weapon teams, are kinda in a weird place to where they might be considered an upgrade or a downgrade, or they might be considered a unique unit that cannot be removed once added. For the purposes of this video, I am treating these weapon teams as upgrades or downgrades that you can change at will, but you might want to check with your own group beforehand. And finally, I just want to bring up how escalation leagues usually have additional requirements to list building. Common ones like no magic items at 500 points or less, or perhaps, no artillery for less than 1,000 points, things like that. Because there are so many potential rules here, I'm not taking any of them into account, but you should be aware of your own league's rules so you can adjust the list accordingly so it's legal when you play. And just one last thing, because I assume when people play escalation leagues, they're learning a new army or perhaps learning the game for the first time. So when I build these lists, I'm going to try to throw in a bit of everything to make sure you have experience casting spells, using ranged units, using artillery. So there'll be a little bit of everything. These won't be the most competitive lists, but they should be fairly balanced around a nice, friendly, casual escalation league. With that out of the way, let's get right into a 500 point list. Now, before I really get into the why of this list, I should really touch on the fact that GW does not recommend playing the old world for less than 1,000 points. It's just not balanced or built for that. Obviously, we do it anyways, but nowhere is it more apparent that it's not built for this than the Skaven in this edition. The Skaven list in this edition has a lot of taxes, meaning I am forced to pay for a certain unit to get access to some other units that I actually want. These taxes are mostly in the form of certain heroes, and most of those heroes aren't available for less than 1,000 points, meaning at 500 points we are very, very limited. So we are running with the chieftain because we have no other option at 500 points, and we're going to go ahead and give him a shield and a biting blade because a biting blade can do work and it's a very cheap magical item. If you have just a little bit of room left in your list, you can probably not go wrong giving somebody a biting blade. When we get to 2,000 points, we will be forced to have at least 2 units of clan rats. So we're just going to take both blocks now so we have them, and by putting 2 blocks here, we're also allowed 2 weapons teams. For these weapon teams, I'm going to default to a Ratling gunner unless I have a good reason to choose otherwise. I like the gunners because they can put out a few good wounds, but most importantly, they can stand and shoot, which will be a big benefit to Skaven and help blunt some charges. But for what it's worth, I have a friend who is trying to make a competitive Skaven list, and he swears by the poison wind mortars, so you might want to do your own experimenting. We don't have access to the full list of rare and special units yet, but we do have access to gutter runners, which are one of the better units in the Skaven book, and so we're definitely going to grab those, we're going to throw some points into them, and we're going to make good use of them. Gutter runners have a lot of special rules, so make sure you understand them before you play your game, because you're going to use them to your advantage to make sure that these never get charged and never face combat that's not on their own terms. At 500 points, our main goal is going to be to try to shoot our opponent off the board with our 2 weapon teams and their gutter runners. We have to get in prolonged combat with our clan rats and even our chieftain. We're probably not going to come out on top. Mostly we are just hanging on till we can get up to 1,000 points and we can bring more good units when our list opens up. So now, at least on paper, our list looks a lot more fun. We do have a lot of models to paint if you're making the jump from 500 to 1,000. But hey, that's what you get for playing Skaven. It is a horde army. We're going to be putting a lot of models on the table. So our chieftain remains, but he is no longer the general. Now he is our BSB, and we're giving him the banner of verminous scurrying so he can help out our gutter runners. We absolutely need our gutter runners to be harassing the enemy and causing chaos in their back lines or in their flanks and dishing out wounds. And they are okay in melee combat, but for the most part we want to keep them out and want to keep them throwing poisoned weapons. With their special rules, they can stand and shoot, then choose to flee, and then auto reform at the end of their turn. That banner is going to help make sure that nothing chases us down after the fleeing, so we never get caught in combat and can keep shooting. We add a Gray Seer as our general, and not only will he hopefully help dispel, but we've given him Demonology and a Lore Familiar because we want to make sure he has Steed of Shadows so he can give our gutter runners flight so they can be even more mobile. And finally, we've added a Warlock Engineer. This is really just the base Warlock Engineer. We don't have the points left over to do much with them. We're just paying for him as attacks so we can add a few more interesting units. We still are taking our minimum of clan rats, but you can see this time I took a warp grinder for one of them rather than 2 rattling gunners. I did this because I think it's kind of flavorful for Skaven to be able to tunnel out in the back of a battlefield, but because this is an escalation league, like I tried to get a mix of everything in there, and I thought it'd be fun to show an ambusher unit. As far as play, we want to ambush with our rattling guns, get into their back line, and hopefully split their focus to take pressure off of our artillery. And if this doesn't sound appealing to you, I would just add in the rattling gunner instead and just trim the points from elsewhere. The giant rats are going to be our screener unit for Skaven. If you don't know what that means, you use these units to screen your own army. They absorb charges for you to help dictate battles on your own terms, but also if you don't need a screener, if you get these giant rats into an enemy backline, they can do work. They are a pretty efficient unit for Skaven. Moving on to the special units, we still have our gutter runners, but we are now adding the Warplock Giselles for a little bit more shooting. These are pretty efficient and hopefully they can score a lot of kills for you. The last unit we have to add is our Warp Lightning Cannon. I think this one might be a little controversial just because in older editions it was kind of seen in bad taste to take an artillery unit at 1,000 points. However, my reasoning is Skaven are not that strong anyways, and artillery has been much nerfed in the old world. I don't think it's out of line power-wise to add artillery here. In fact, if I was making this list more competitive and wasn't trying to show off every aspect of the game, I probably wouldn't add the cannon at all and would instead use a Doom Wheel in this list. Play-wise, more than anything else, we still want to shoot our opponent off the board. Make sure to make use of your Demonology signature spell to shoot some magic missiles, your rattling gun, and of course your Warplock Giselles and artillery should all be able to do work. Just a quick note on artillery, instinctually you might want to take that big cannon and point it at like a scary monster. And in previous editions that'd be right, but in this edition you're much more efficient to use your artillery to kill things like cavalry rather than a dragon. At 1500 points, the overall strategy of this list doesn't change much, but we do have a lot more balance now that we're bringing both the Hell Pit Abomination and Rat Ogres. Our Skaven Chieftain stays relatively untouched. I did drop the Biting Blade on this just because we had to have the extra points into the core units to hit the minimum, and I just couldn't find points for the Biting Blade, although you might try to find them yourself and have better luck than I did. The Gray Seer is also quite similar to what we ran in the last list, except now he's level 4 so he doesn't get bullied into silence and can more easily cast spells and dispel spells himself. We added a Warpstone Musket to our Engineer, but honestly I think that might just be more because I think it's cool. I'm not sure how useful it would be. And although we have it listed as battle magic here, remember that he does have the Skaven lore, and you can change that out for the Skaven spells, which is probably a better use of him. Warp Lightning should absolutely do work, even though he's not a true mage. We buffed up the clan rats here some, but that's really just so we hit the minimum points on this list. You could have also easily just added a few giant rats here and there. These clan rats are mostly a tax for our weapons teams, but they also make for a good roadblock to help protect your artillery and ranged units. We added another unit of giant rats, and that's mostly because we do need more screening. We want to protect our abomination from charges if we can, and we also have rat ogres now with frenzy that we want to make sure they're not getting pulled into combat that we don't want them to be in. Gutter runners and the Giselles are basically doing the same thing we've had them do before. Hopefully you have that down by now. We want our gutter runners to be disturbing shit, and we're very careful of positioning so they don't get charged, and we're hoping our Giselles can pick off some expensive units from afar. The rat ogres are very strong, but we're very careful with how we use them and where we put them because they do have frenzy. You might want to put them in between your clan rats so you could help direct which direction your rat ogres charge. The abomination is full of special rules. Make sure you know how they work before putting this on the tabletop. But really, this is a very efficient and very cheap monster. And even though he has a random number of attacks at times and a random movement, it should do a lot of work for you if you adequately screen for it with your giant rats. At around this point level, your opponents might start taking dragons, and this is a huge problem for any Skaven list. You absolutely will struggle with dragons. Skaven just don't have a lot of reasonable ways to trade. You could try pumping points into a warlord and a fellblade, but even then you're probably on the losing end. It's a lot of risk for a lot of points, and you're not going to win most of the time. I would instead try to work around the other dragon. If you can ground them to a point where you can get several units to charge it at once, go ahead and go for it. Otherwise, you might want to switch your Grey Seer over to Illusion and use the spells to try to ground the dragon. You also have a Storm Banner that can take the dragon out and not let him move for at least one turn. I know none of these solutions are ideal, but I think that's just a situation you have to deal with when you are at Skaven. If somebody has a reliable way to kill a dragon, please put it in the comments below. I'd love to hear it. It's really just a hole in this army list. But it's something you might want to think about, because if we didn't see a dragon at 1500 points, you are probably going to see a dragon at 2000. So I'm actually going to show you two different lists you could do at 2000 points, and this is the first one. And I built this basically if you want to run Storm Vermin. Mostly, I am just taking a leap here. I am assuming that if you're doing an escalation league in Skaven, you're fairly new to it, and you're probably excited about the Storm Vermin, which are their elite infantry, some of their coolest models, and I just figure you want to fill them, and this list will do that. So we are now going to embed our chieftain inside the Storm Vermin. We're going to give it the banner of superiority and its biting blade back rather than the scurrying, and this will give increased combat resolution for your Storm Vermin. It's a very strong banner. It's pretty expensive at 50 points, but it's almost always worth it. We're putting our Grey Seer on top of a Screaming Bell. Is this the most efficient unit in the list? No, but it's a lot of fun. And I'm running a meme build here where I take the lore familiar Illusion and Ogre Blade just to give him hella strong attacks. Magic is of course to taste. You can definitely try other schools of magic here if you don't want to go Illusion. This is just a combination I really like, and that's what I would run in this list. Our engineer is basically just attacks. We want to put him someplace where he can move around and occasionally cast Warp Lightning, but that's pretty much his only role, is to give us the units we actually want. In our core units, we've invested quite a bit into our Storm Vermin. They are actually a fairly strong unit when it comes to infantry in the old world, but it is limited by being infantry, and they are quite expensive. That being said, we're going to put our banner in there. We want to invest with them. We have 20 of them, almost 300 points, but it should hit pretty hard as far as infantry goes. This time with the gutter runners, we're giving them ambush so they can start in the back lines and start wreaking havoc as soon as they come into the game. We still have our Warlock Giselles, our Rat Ogres. We added a couple of Globadiers here. Two's not enough, but they still have a pretty strong attack. It can help protect your back line is how I'd use them in this list. This first list is great in the fact that it's fluffy and will probably help get the models you want on the tabletop, but personally I'd run a list more like this second one. Rather than investing heavy points into our storm vermin, we are instead just going to take more clan rats at the minimum so we can field more weapon teams and hopefully shoot our opponent off the board. Chieftain gets downgraded so we can fit a few different things. He's back to having the banner of verminous scurrying, and it's probably best to place him back into the gutter runners. I have no additional weapon here for them, I just couldn't find room for it. You could probably strip something here or there if you wanted to give him a biting blade or something else to make him more of a melee threat. Bracier I left unchanged. You could also make him more shooty if you wanted to lean into that even more. And then the Warp Block Engineer, we removed his gun, we just didn't have room for it, but mostly he's just there as attacks and to occasionally cast Warp Lightning anyways. We now have 4 Rattling guns, which hopefully puts out a lot of shots and can take out units before they reach you. It's not going to be easy to run these Rattling guns correctly. There are times you want them slightly behind your parent unit so they can't be targeted by spells and shooting, but at the same time there are going to be times when you want that Rattling gun in front, so when an opponent charges they have to charge the Rattling gun and they have to take a stand and shoot, even if that Rattling gun is going to be punished for it. Our gutter runners have lost ambush, but they're still going to be an important unit. We're still going to use them to chip away at our opponent, and thanks to that banner, it should be very hard to charge them, and combat should always be dictated on their terms. The other major change is we are now a lot more threatening with our Globadiers. These are one of the most efficient units in the Skaven list. They show up in competitive lists a lot. In fact, if you're facing a lot of cavalry heavy lists, you might want to try to squeeze in more of these. Both lists should function for an escalation league and they should be pretty okay for you. This is the list I would lean towards just because I like Skaven as a more shooty, and in general I try to focus an army in one direction if I can, although that is hard for Skaven. But this list will force you to add a lot more new models than the other one will, and especially if this is a new army for you and you're painting as you go along, that could be a pretty big ask. Of course, this is just one way to build Skaven. Obviously, because we have so many units taxed behind these heroes, half of the Skaven list wasn't even available to me when I made this. So if I was making a list where I wanted to make use of the plague units, this is the direction I would take things. The monks and the plague sensors are really great in melee, so I just ended up, moving this whole list to focus on melee rather than shooting. But I would take this more of a starting point rather than a finished list. I think there's a lot more tweaking that can be done to make this even viable for an escalation league. But if this is the direction you want to go, you can start with this list and then work your way back to 500 points. Building out this army in any of the lists you went shouldn't be that bad. Almost all of these units I use in this list have recently got a refresh from GW. And for the most part, most of them should rank up pretty well, so you can definitely rely on using the new units. Not all of them are out for individual purchase yet, but they should be coming out soon, and you should be able to buy part of the starter box for pretty cheap from people who just want the Stormcast side, and you can take all the Skaven models. And due to this refresh, you should be able to find a lot of the older models for very cheap right now from people who just want to upgrade their army, or from local game stores who haven't sold their old stock yet. Now is probably a good time to scoop it up if you want those older sculpts. So because that's simple enough, what I really want to take this time to talk about is unit fillers, and I think they're pretty important for Skaven. The way I built this out, especially if you use the list with 4 different clan rats, that's 80 models on the table that get shot off very fast, so that is a perfect scenario for unit fillers. For those of you that don't know, a unit filler is usually on a bigger base, so if your clan rats are on 25mm, you might start out with a 50x50, and you do a little modeling on there and it represents 4 clan rats at once rather than having 4 separate clan rat models. And it is pretty easy to get a unit filler on theme for Skaven. You could just do some rats, you could do some sewer gates, some ruins look really well. The sky's the limit. If you're really willing to spend money, you could also use some of these hero units from the war bands or underworlds models that are incredibly looking models, and they should sit up above your army. It should give a real nice thematic look. And finally, if you're looking for a third-party vendor, whether to add a little variety or just to save a little bit of money from buying GW, I'd recommend looking at Vinci Miniatures. I don't know of a lot of good third-party vendors doing Skaven, but this guy does. They're really great. I'd especially recommend them rather than the GW gutter runners, which are very old and very out of date right now. I don't know, he's definitely worth checking out. I'll put a link in the comments. His sculpts are overall very nice and very modular, which I really appreciate. So that is probably where I'll leave this. Hopefully these lists helped you, or if not directly, hopefully it inspired you to make your own. And like I said before, if you have a good, reliable way for a Skaven army in the old world to kill a dragon or other flying monstrous creature, please let me know in the comments. I'm sure a lot of people would appreciate it. And as always, thanks for watching.